turning now to our speaker today, Ismael Velasco. He's been a Baha'i for 30 years. He's been involved in the community building process, both inside the Baha'i community and outside of it, in 20 different countries, gaining the opportunity to see many of these processes across a wide diversity of contexts. And this, of course, is very exciting. He has experience from the Pacific area, from Africa and other places. So we have a real great opportunity now to sort of see what community building looks like around the world. Academically, he has published in the field of Baha'i scholarship and social action, and professionally is focused on community development around the world. So with that, I will now introduce, turn everything over to Ismael. Ismael, thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted that you've been able to join us, and we thank you very much.
Thank you again for this opportunity. I'd like to begin by saying that I claim absolutely no expertise in this. I've had the opportunity, as I'm sure many of you have, of doing my best to take the processes of community building forward, and studied as much as I could to understand as little as I have. And yes, I have had the opportunity to see very different contexts in which Baha'is are trying to achieve sort of their mission. And I hope that some of the thoughts that I share resonate and are of some use or value to somebody today. Really, I've focused on this in terms of how Baha'is work to change the world, which means that we begin with a question that many great people, in a sense, perhaps every good person throughout the history of humanity has asked in some way or other, and which Baha'u'llah asked again in the 19th century. How long will injustice continue? How long is chaos and confusion to reign amongst men? How long will discord agitate the face of society? The signs of impending convulsions and chaos can now be discerned, inasmuch as the prevailing order appears to be lamentably defective. So we have lived throughout human history with the burden of injustice and conflict. And as time has gone by, we had made progress. We have grown as a society, but clearly the challenges remain. And great thinkers across the world have prescribed their solutions. They have identified what the causes are according to them, and have given birth to many movements to change this, to transform this. And in that global scope, apart from any claims that one might make, spiritually speaking, Baha'u'llah's thought, Baha'u'llah's vision is within that tradition. It is an answer to this perennial question. How do we turn the challenges that afflict the planet in some ways, in unprecedented ways and scale, in ways that are, for the first time in history, existential to the entire planet, and certainly to life within it? What is the solution to this? How do we address this? And some, for example, Marx would have focused the problem and the solution around economics and power and the conflict of classes, and others might position it in other places. Baha'u'llah places it around the oneness of humanity. He wrote, "The tabernacle of unity has been raised. Regard ye not one another as strangers. Of one tree are all ye the fruit, and of one bough the leaves. The world is but one country, and mankind its citizens. Let not a man glory in that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind." And so, for Baha'u'llah, the key challenge is disunity. And the key solution and the key destination is unity. Unity is both our vision and our tool. It is both our goal and our pathway. And unity of humanity from the perspective of Baha'u'llah means a lot more than simply a feeling of oneness with one another, a spirit of kindness and support from one another. Rather, it means a restructuring of the whole of society, of an entire system, global system, that has been reared on the premise of distinction and competition between different identities and interests, whether it be one nation against another, or one tribe against another, or one religion against another. The premise of this is that the time that we're living in is a time of maturity, that we're transitioning to the time where that unity becomes possible for the first time. So this is a fantastically great vision. And it's one that we have been working toward since the time of Baha'u'llah. And if one looks at this as that process of change, then it begins with a story, and it begins with a dream, and it begins with an example that gets multiplied through love and attraction. And the story is a story that, in a sense, is what distinguishes philosophies of change from revelation, from true religion in that sense. Because there are a myriad philosophies that prescribe what the challenges are, what the solutions are, that champion different sets of beliefs and ideals. And in that sense, the teachings of Baha'u'llah are another set of beliefs and ideals and solutions. But they are also beliefs and ideas that are grounded in a story, a grand narrative of evolution and of progress. A story that has been told by seers and prophets and poets from the beginning of time. The promise that one day would come when humanity would become one, when swords would be beaten into plowshares, when war would cease, when all of the world would live in harmony. And this prophetic vision is the high paean of the songs of every scripture, whether it's Islamic or Buddhist or Christian or Zoroastrian. They have perpetuated this common story of purposefulness, that history is not random, but it is moving in a direction that, through all the chaos and sorrow and missteps and cataclysms and blood and loss, is ultimately abundant and beneficent, that life and the universe are on our side, that there is a direction to change. And in the same way that the Big Bang was a cataclysmic explosion, and that since that Big Bang, galaxies have exploded and stars have collapsed and ecosystems have been destroyed, but actually what we have seen is the emergence of complexity, ever richer, from pure energy to matter, to cells, to vegetables, to animals, to a crazy Mexican able to discuss all this on video internationally. We have been evolving. Admittedly, I may be an exception to that, but as a human species, we have been evolving. And likewise, the history of humanity is one of war and chaos and conflict and destruction and domination and greed. But ultimately, it is the narrative of, again, emerging complexity from the family to the tribe to the city-state to the nation. Somehow, across all the cataclysms and failures that we inflict on ourselves and on each other, the arc of history is abundant and it bends toward oneness. And in that sense, we are now at a stage where for the first time it is logistically possible to make these prophecies of oneness self-fulfilling. And in a sense, any prophecy worth its salt is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is not a prophecy that happens through sheer magic, but it's actually part of the evolution of life itself. And it is something that can be influenced by our efforts. And it is within this perspective that Baha'u'llah announced the feasibility at last of the goal of the unification of humanity. But of course, from the point of vision to the point of realization, there is a long path. There is a long intermediate space that has to be filled by precisely the efforts that make the prophecy self-fulfilling. In other words, we have to somehow be so enamored of this story, be so convinced of its possibility, that we're willing to arise against all odds and turn our dreams into steps. And that's what's extremely hard to do, and what historically religions uniquely have achieved at scale. The ability to inspire heart to heart, one by one, often from extremely inauspicious beginnings, like a crucifixion, a movement of masses that eventually raise civilizations. And so when Baha'u'llah in the 19th century proclaimed the oneness of humanity, all he had was the story of his own example, the sheer perfection of a life, his own, the Bab's before him, that generated a moral beauty that attracted ready souls to that vision and made them make crazy decisions, amazing choices to give credence to those values. And so we reach the beginning of the sort of, or rather 1921, the passing of Abdul-Baha, at a point where the Baha'i community was this great movement of progressive souls with a vision of oneness spread across the world. And they had the capacity to believe together, to dream together, to envision together, but they did not have the capacity to act together, to build together on a global scale. And that became the next stage, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think what we can say is that what we are doing today as a Baha'i community is to take forward that vision, to take forward those steps, and to attempt to implement in a concerted way that dream and bring a step closer that realization. And so the Universal House of Justice says, the work advancing in every corner of the globe today represents the latest stage in the ongoing Baha'i endeavors to create the nucleus of the glorious civilization enshrined in his teaching, the building of which is an enterprise of infinite complexity and scale, one that will demand centuries of exertion by humanity to bring to fruition. I'll return to that. So what Baha'is are doing globally today represents the latest stage. So our process of this, from that first dream, from that first vision, for that first attraction, to that world civilization we foresee the whole of history is moving towards, we move in stages. And today, we find ourselves in one stage. And this framework of action that we will explore represents the latest stage of a Baha'i endeavor that began right at the beginning to create the nucleus of that glorious civilization. So a nucleus is that living center and pattern out of which cells multiply and grow. So our aim is not to conquer the world, but to create a nucleus that embodies the vision that we aspire to. And that vision, and this is extremely distinctive in the Baha'i approach to change, is that our vision is not measured in decades. We have the capacity to hope and to envisage a change that we anticipate will take centuries. We recognize that the enterprise of unifying humanity and building a new world order based on that principle of unity is an enterprise of infinite complexity and scale. It never ends, because of course, once we're one, we can keep building as one. And it will demand centuries of exertion by humanity to bring to fruition. There are no shortcuts, no formulas. So this framework is not a shortcut or a formula. Only as effort is made to draw on the insights from his revelation, to tap into the accumulating knowledge of the human race, to apply his teachings intelligently to the life of humanity, and to consult on the questions that arise, will the necessary learning occur and capacity be developed. So if we take that backwards, our immediate goal is to achieve learning and develop capacity. If we're learning and building capacity, we are on the right track. So the purpose of this framework of Baha'i action is to enable global society to learn and grow in capacity to move toward oneness. And concretely, we are inspired by a sense that this vision is onto something, that we are not just improvising, but that somehow, when in the middle of the 19th century, Baha'u'llah identified what would become the future fault lines, the current urgent consensus of our needs, the equality of men and women, the harmony of science and religion, the abolition of extremes of poverty and wealth, the reconciliation of races and religion, the universal education of humanity, the empowerment of every individual to be co-participants in building the societies they will inhabit and they inhabit right now. All of these ideals that Baha'u'llah proclaimed at the time of Queen Victoria and Napoleon III and empire and slavery, when the Pope still had armies, that prescience, that vision, we believe, is more than a hunch. It is a disclosure, a revelation, in the same way that Da Vinci saw the helicopter centuries before the means for its construction had emerged. And yet perhaps it would be fair to say that it was born when he first drew that impossible prototype, because his vision was not a hunch, but genuine vision that pierced into the trends and possibilities ahead, in the same way the vision of the oneness of humanity that Baha'u'llah formulated pierced into the needs that would become the global consensus. And so perhaps it is reasonable to anticipate that his solutions likewise were prescient and likewise were in tune with the direction of the planet. And so we draw on insights from that vision, from that inspired insight, and also tap into the accumulating knowledge of the human race. That is to say, however inspired that vision is, however true those writings are, they lack context to be understood. One could not understand what Baha'u'llah meant by the oneness of humanity in 19th century Qajar Persia. One could only get a glimpse of the direction. We had to develop things like the internet. When in the 1930s, Shoghi Effendi spoke about a mechanism of world communication that would transmit information instantly, the internet was not within the scope of conception, let alone of possibility. But Shoghi Effendi clearly drew on the insights of his revelation and, working backwards, identified that for humanity to be one, at some point it would need to be able to communicate as one, and thus was able to foresee or anticipate a technological development that would not come for quite a long time. And so we tap into the accumulating knowledge of the human race to understand what it does mean to be one. We don't know, we don't really know what the unity of humanity means. We discover this iteratively. And we do so by trying to apply these insights and that knowledge intelligently to the life of humanity, until questions arise in which we consult greater and greater numbers, which allows learning to occur and capacity to be developed. And if we carry this on for a few centuries, we believe a civilization awaits that exceeds the dreams of the most ambitious and optimistic seers. So, if we begin with this sense of vision, that's all we had 100 years ago as the Baha'i community. In the West, it was widely known as the Baha'i movement. It was as an amorphous collection of deeply committed individuals who worked in their best way toward the oneness of humanity. But the oneness of humanity is more than that. It represents the ability to build and act together as a single system on a global scale. And that simply did not exist anywhere in the planet. So when Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, in 1921, started his ministry, his first conclusion was that, in the same way that Archimedes said, give me a point of support and I can move the world with a lever, Shoghi Effendi identified that if Baha'is were to take these steps, if Baha'is were to actually be able to do justice to this vision, they had to be able to consult at a global scale. They had to be able to learn at a global scale. They had to be able to plan at a global scale. And they needed a framework. And he also saw that that framework was identified in the writings of Baha'u'llah and the writings of Abdul-Baha, particularly his Will and Testament. And it's interesting that in 1930 or so, Shoghi Effendi wrote that the implications of that Will and Testament would not be understood until at least 100 years of actual work had happened. And in 2021, in 2 years, 100 years of actual work will have taken place. And we are beginning to see the delineation. So the very first stage of our implementation of this vision ushered what in the Baha'i writings is called the Formative Age, in which we still are. This intermediate period between the moment of inspiration and heroism and the moment of realization and unity. And this long formative age, the first thing was to create a system And this is a system in which Baha'is who had been in the Baha'i community for a long time grew up and were used to. And so we had a set of institutions like the local spiritual assembly, national spiritual assembly, eventually the Universal House of Justice, the Arm of the Learned. And these were institutions that we devoted some 75 years to building around the world, to ensuring that they were available, and the sacrifices that people made to make this possible were immense. When people left their jobs, their careers, their communities to move to remote places so that these institutions could emerge in a way that was representative of the globality of humanity. Until 2,100 ethnic groups and nationalities could be represented and consult and learn together. And there were various activities that we were focused on. Now, what was very interesting is that in this period, because our focus was on infrastructure, on the skeleton that would allow us to move, to change, actually being a Baha'i did not give us many opportunities to influence our immediate environment. And our focus was primarily inward looking. Our vision was universal, but our activities were for Baha'is only, the core of them. Baha'is built those institutions, the local assemblies, the national assemblies, the Baha'i funds. Only Baha'is can contribute to funds that fund the Baha'i community. We had a very clear distinction between those who were Baha'is and those who were non-Baha'is. And we tried to encourage those who weren't to become Baha'is, so that we would have the numbers that would allow us to begin at some point in the future to turn our attention back outside, to use this new administrative capacity to transform the world in alignment with the vision and the promise of Baha'u'llah's revelation. Now, naturally, if you spend 75 years focusing on your infrastructure, that will create a culture, a pattern of thinking, a pattern of relating, a pattern of identity. And that pattern of identity and relating and thinking began to be transformed toward the 3-year plan and the 6-year plan, and then in the late 90s, and eventually began to coalesce into a new pattern, a pattern which was a fantastic luxury in many ways. Because those of us who experienced this phase of Baha'i community building dreamt of the day when we would be able to translate our ideals into tangible action in our immediate surroundings. And we toiled and we sacrificed and we lived, and in some cases we died, in the hope that our efforts would make it possible for those that came later to take the next step and take us to the next stage, where we could translate that which had been written into reality and action in community after community. And wonderfully, and disorientatingly as well, this is where we are today. And this change of culture has brought with it new sets of institutions, new features, new languages. And in some places, these languages, these terms are very familiar. And in others, they remain alien. There is a saying that a sci-fi writer, Gibson, wrote that is very true of technology, and I think it's true in many other domains, and it's true in this domain too, that the future is here, but it is not evenly distributed. So in that sense, we have different time zones in the Baha'i community. In some places, we are still perhaps in this universe. In others, we are at the forefront of this new universe. And what is the difference? The difference is that today our focus is not inward, but outward. And our activities are not exclusive, but inclusive and collaborative. And our mission is not purely one of a preparatory one, but it's actually one that involves realizing this vision of oneness with all of us, in all of our community. So if in the past we had the education of Baha'i children, today we have the Baha'i education of all children. If in the past we had non-Baha'is who joined Baha'i activities, today we have community building activities, which a community of interest builds together, and where the distinction between who is a Baha'i and who is not a Baha'i becomes blurred, and Baha'i identity becomes a spectrum, and where the focus is not on how many enrollments we have, how many more people call themselves Baha'is, the focus is on how many people, Baha'is and others, are collaborating systematically in bringing new patterns of life to their communities. The experience of the Baha'i community may be seen as an example of this enlarging unity. It is a community drawn from many nations, cultures, classes, and creeds, engaged in a wide range of activities, serving the spiritual, social, and economic needs of the peoples of many lands. It is a single social organism, representative of the diversity of the human family, conducting its affairs through a system of commonly accepted consultative principles, and cherishing equally all the great outpourings of divine guidance in human history. Its existence is yet another convincing proof of the practicality of its founder's vision of a united world, another evidence that humanity can live as one global society, equal to whatever challenges its coming of age may entail. If the Baha'i experience can contribute in whatever measure to reinforcing hope in the unity of the human race, we are happy to offer it as a model for study. This was written by the Universal House of Justice in 1985. And it is a very powerful concept because it identifies a distinctive feature of the Baha'i approach to social change. Once we have identified, diagnosed the problems of humanity, and identified our own chosen solution in the oneness of humanity, in the equality of men and women, in the education of children, etc., in the oneness of religion and the abolition of religious prejudice. Once we've identified these ideals, our approach is not then to force others into accepting them, to lobby hard and pressure governments and vested interests to take on this urgent solution to the needs of humanity. Rather, our methodology is to demonstrate the practicality of our vision by embodying it in action. By 1985, we had achieved that at a global level. At a global level, in a world that is highly divided, we had achieved what a sociologist who was not a Baha'i in the early 90s, I forget his name, described as the single most diverse, unified body of people on earth. We had demonstrated that it was possible for the whole diversity of humanity to accept its oneness and work together in microcosm. And that was beautiful and extraordinary. Those of us who were blessed in 1992 to attend the Baha'i World Congress in New York, there were 30,000 Baha'is from 165 countries. Some had bones in their nose from Papua New Guinea. I remember him very well. Others wore proudly their Native American dress. The whole of humanity was represented. And the quality of those relationships, of those interactions, even casually on the street when you were buying an ice cream and you didn't even know that person was or wasn't a Baha'i, but there was a starting point of acceptance and of joy and of recognition of our oneness. That was before you had said hello or introduced yourself, you began with a feeling of rapport from the simple fact of being human. And seeing that at scale was a remarkable act of vision and moment that demonstrated, as it says here, the practicality of Baha'u'llah's vision. But this vision of a unified world is not a mere ideal, but a practical scenario. And that our experience as Baha'is might be of help to others who might be able to, who might want to learn and share their own learning about how to achieve patterns of life that are effective and unifying across the barriers that increasingly divide us. But today, our challenge and opportunity and joyous privilege is that we are called to demonstrate in the same way that we have done so at a global level, at a local level, our ability to create organisms, communities, units of civilization that are based and expressed and implement and demonstrate the oneness of humanity. Every human being and every group of individuals, irrespective of whether they are counted among his followers, can take inspiration from his teachings, benefiting from whatever gems of wisdom and knowledge will aid them in addressing the challenges they face. Indeed, the civilization that beckons humanity will not be attained through the efforts of the Baha'i community alone. Numerous groups and organizations, animated by the spirit of world solidarity that is an indirect manifestation of Baha'u'llah's conception of the principle of the oneness of humankind, will contribute to the civilization destined to emerge out of the welter and chaos of present-day society. It should be clear to everyone that the capacity created in the Baha'i community over successive global plans renders it increasingly able to lend assistance to the manifold and diverse dimensions of civilization building, opening to it new frontiers of learning. So we do not see ourselves as the exclusive actors. We are not the saviors of humanity. We are not the solution, the tribe that everyone must join. Rather, we are at the arrowhead of oneness. We are at the forefront of unity, together with all those numerous groups and organizations animated by the spirit of world solidarity. We see Baha'u'llah's conception of the principle of the oneness of humankind being manifested both within the Baha'i community and in the world at large. And what we need is the ability to coalesce for all those forces of solidarity to find a way to build together. And that is our modest contribution, is to create nodes, to create points of contact, centers of attraction, spaces where all of those forces can coincide and together address the challenges that they face. So if I live in a community that has huge problems with racism, that's a challenge that we all face in my community. How do we transform that together? And over successive plans of action, the Baha'i community has grown in capacity. Remember, that was our goal. There is now has been created in the Baha'i community the capacity to increasingly lend assistance in the manifold and diverse dimensions of civilization building. So our goal is not to go out and recruit as many people to join our congregation. Our goal is to make available the capacities of our communities to our environments so that together we can lend assistance to building units of civilization in every locality. So how do we do this concretely? Baha'is are engaged in cities and villages across the globe in establishing a pattern of life in which increasing numbers, irrespective of background, are invited to take part. So that is the first thing. Our aspiration is not to lobby for a policy change, nor to achieve conversions. Our aspiration is to establish a pattern of life in our communities in which increasing numbers, so a dynamic pattern, a pattern that is growing, irrespective of background. It doesn't matter whether it's Baha'i or Christian or atheist or Satanist. It doesn't matter what your background is. If you want to move toward the oneness of humanity and address the difficulties that afflict your community and build a pattern of life that is healthy and empowering, we invite you to help us find out how. And in that process, we have a certain framework of what that pattern means to us. This pattern, expressive of the dynamic coherence between the material and spiritual dimensions of life. The pattern involves a coherence between the material and the spiritual dimensions of life. Our attitudes, our values, our behaviors are intrinsically part of the solution to the social problems of our neighborhood. Conversely, if we are not engaged in the processes and problems and trials and difficulties of our neighborhood, we are not perhaps fully expressing our spiritual values. Because how can you express love without action? How can you claim compassion without solidarity? So we're hoping to build a pattern which has a dynamic coherence between the material and the spiritual dimensions of life. And this pattern includes classes for the spiritual education of children, in which they also develop a deep appreciation for the fundamental unity of the various world religions. So we want to raise children with a sense of spirituality that is not exclusivistic, but inclusive and universal, so that the blight of religious prejudice is lost and the power of spirituality is harnessed from an early age. Groups that assist young people to navigate a crucial stage of their lives and to withstand the corrosive forces that specially target them. To be able to go through puberty, through adolescence, with all the peer pressures, all the opportunities and challenges of social media, and come out the other side with an empowering peer group, with capacities for service, with self-esteem and a sense of nobility. Circles of study wherein participants reflect on the spiritual nature of existence and build capacity for service to the community and society. That is a place where not specialized individuals or experts are in charge of taking forward the needs of our community, but where we are all training each other and gaining capacity to affect our environment and generate knowledge together. Gatherings for collective worship that strengthen the devotional character of the community. Spaces where, amidst the material push of day to day, we experience emotions and relationships that connect us to the sacred, that lift us from the mundane, that remind us that there's something higher than whatever is distracting us each day, that makes us replenish ourselves and renew our vision. And in time, a growing range of endeavors for social and economic development. So as these things evolve, we achieve the capacity to serve. This pattern of community life is giving rise to vibrant and purposeful new communities, wherein relationships are founded on the oneness of humankind, universal participation, justice, and freedom from prejudice. All are welcome. The process which is unfolding seeks to foster collaboration and build capacity within every human group, with no regard to class or religious background, with no concern for ethnicity or race, and irrespective of gender or social status, to arise and contribute to the advancement of civilization. So this is the vision, and this is what we're doing. And these core activities did not come by chance. They came from iteration. We tried in 2,100 ethnic groups and nationalities to build community and learn what works. And eventually we discovered that in communities where these building blocks were present, communities transformed. That if you were simultaneously addressing the spiritual education of children, the mobilization of young people, the training and capacity building of adults, the spirituality of the community, and the engagement in social action, that transformation happened. So this became our core. Where are we now? What impact have our efforts had so far? Where is the Baha'i community in its learning in this new stage of applying this framework? The first is engagement. The worldwide community has shown the capacity to engage at any given time over 1 million people in such activities, helping them to explore and respond to spiritual reality. So at this stage, this is from this year, we are at any one time mobilizing 1 million people in working together toward building this pattern of life. That's quite remarkable when you then elaborate on the impacts of this. So my junior youth group that I animate in Newport, 4 of those children, as one of their acts of service, ran a workshop on diversity for all of their classmates. So those 4 moved or engaged a further 60, I think, 60 or 70 young people. So if you think how many people, these 1 million, are engaging themselves, clearly the impact that the Baha'i community is having globally and our modest, tiny local efforts aggregate into a very significant contribution. The other impact that this framework has had has been in building communities, building the capacity of communities. An example, Makeni, which I visited once in Sierra Leone. Within a period of just over 4 years, the cluster moved from having 8 core activities, of the ones we described earlier, with 53 participants, none of whom were junior youth, to about 200 core activities in which 2,000 individuals participate. with a corresponding increase in the number of human resources. In Samoa, in 2 years, the number of classes in the cluster grew from 16 with 100 participants to 127 engaging 1,000 children, which I estimate is about 10% of all the children in the likely age bracket in that island. So these are more dramatic examples, but the point is that this framework is allowing us to gradually build our capacity from very modest starting points in an iterative way over time to increasingly more impactful, which takes us to the level of scale. In 2015, 4 years ago already, there were 200 clusters around the world where there were tens of individuals mobilizing hundreds in this process. Among these 200 clusters, and there would be many hundred more by now, there are over 1,000 inhabitants, sometimes several thousand, taking part in this well-established pattern of activity, raising communities whose habits of thought and action are rooted in this vision of the oneness of humanity that Baha'u'llah has given us. As an example, in Delhi, the community was sustaining 1,000 core activities, mobilizing 7,000 local residents, including 200 junior youth groups and 250 children's classes. In Lumumbashi, 600 active participants, Baha'is and others, were mobilizing over 10,000 people at the time. So at the very frontiers of learning, this is beginning to help us learn not just how to build communities that are vibrant and transformative, but how to transform societies. In these clusters, where, for example, there are villages where all the children and all the junior youth are engaged in this process of education and service and action, and the impacts have been significant. The government has asked the Baha'i community for advice. The social action is beginning to change the way society works itself. They are in such clusters, they are seeking to understand how a flourishing local population can transform the society of which it is an integral part. This will be a new frontier of learning for the foreseeable future, where insights will be generated for the benefit of the whole Baha'i world. So we are all in a spectrum and moving towards this. And what this framework tells us is that wherever we are in a continuum that allows us, through a set of structures and means, to build our capacities locally until what is currently the frontier becomes the norm, and the frontier is pushed yet further. So I'm aware that time has now come. It's sort of to finish this session. So I would point you to a video which is called A Wider Embrace. You can find it on YouTube, and it can give you examples of how this framework is being applied at different stages in different parts of the world. I was going to show you 3 or 4 minutes of an example, but I think it's probably good if at this point I stop and sort of let Robert decide whether we have questions or what happens next.
Thank you, Ismael. That's fascinating information and a fantastic review of the statements that we've received from the Universal House of Justice, and of course the reports of the plan telling us really what the results have been. And if you want to show the video, I think we probably have the time. But I'd also like to hear some of your personal experiences, because as I understand it, you have experienced some of these clusters that are in a fairly advanced stage in Africa. And I was wondering if you had any stories you could tell us about your experience there.
Sorry. I wouldn't. Yes, I'm not muted, right. I wouldn't say that I have direct experience of the most advanced clusters, no. I have had experience of some really intensive processes in various parts of the world. But I think I think sort of in terms of stories, it's hard to tell because I'm a natural storyteller. So it's hard to go into a story like this without diving in depth. But I'd like to maybe share one. And it's not really about scale, but about outlook. This was when I went to visit Sierra Leone. I went to visit Sierra Leone to work on a project with former child soldiers. And it was a project run by the Red Cross, a very powerful project. These children were now grown, but they had amputated the limbs of people and murdered their entire family and villages, etc. They had war crimes on their hands. And this project was a beautiful project, Youth as Agents of Behavior Change, that was working toward helping these young men, mostly, and young women who had been child brides or war brides, to become positive agents of change in their communities. It was very beautiful, very inspiring, and a wonderful reminder that transformation is within all our reaches. If they could change, we all can. But my story is the fact that when we arrived, there were 3 of us, and we were all representing international organizations. I was there representing Brighton University, someone from Geneva, and someone from, and so we were VIP, so to speak. And the Red Cross, we were going to be based in a very remote village. And we traveled there, stopped. It was quite interesting because the moment I arrived at the Red Cross office, there was a phone call for me. And I had let the Baha'ís know that I was coming to Sierra Leone. And so one Baha'i happened to call me at the Red Cross, and I met them, and we had a consultation. And they were telling me about their progress within the framework. They were learning about children's classes and junior youth programs. And so was I. And somehow my experience in Britain was of immediate relevance to their experience in Sierra Leone. Now, we got into the minibus after that and drove 4 hours, which was half the distance. And as we stop in that village, the door opens, and there's this lovely old man, and this village is Makeni, where this growth has happened that I mentioned. And he says, Allah Pa, welcome. And he welcomes all of us, whether we're Baha'is or not. He's already booked us a place in the local restaurant. And we eat, and we sort of gel together, etc., and then get back on the bus and finally arrive at our destination. And now it's 1 a.m. But it so happens that the president of Sierra Leone is visiting that village, and all the accommodation is taken by him and his cohort. And so you have the Red Cross with all these international VIPs and nowhere to put them. And so we went to one B&B and it was closed, and another one was closed, and you could see they were getting more and more agitated. And this Mexican from Britain, who has been there for 12 hours, phones late at night the old man in the village before, who phones an older man in the village that we're in, who invites us. And the Red Cross is desperate enough by then that they say, okay, we'll go and check it out. And we arrive, and the man is very poor. He lives in an agricultural industrial state. And the moment the door opens, he doesn't ask which of us is a Baha'i. He hugs every single one of us. He says, you are my family. You are welcome to stay with us. And he has kicked out his daughter from her bed and room at now 2 a.m. and sent her to a neighbor. So the girl that came with us, the woman that came with us from Geneva, can have her own bedroom, and accommodates the other 2 foreigners there. Never once mentions money. The volunteers from the Red Cross are a little bit suspicious, but also desperate. So they just go, okay. And when we sit down, this man used to be the local imam of the mosque. And then when he was doing the third book of the Ruhi sequence, because he wanted to help build children's classes, he eventually joined the Baha'i community. But the broader community was not in the faith. They were just part of the process of addressing the needs of the children there. And what was fascinating was that not only did we share this unity, for him, the oneness of humanity was not just an ideal. I actually had a family. Not only did I have a family as a Baha'i, but my friends who were not Baha'is had a family in the most remote village. And in addition, we actually had a framework that allowed our experience to enrich each other in practical ways and aggregate our learning across totally different social realities. So this to me is an example of how this oneness of humanity becomes embodied in a framework for action that becomes a way of including everyone and that allows us to act locally and globally at the very same time. And it's also quite a fun experience.
That's really a fantastic story. Thank you so much for that, Ismael. Really, really fascinating and a good example of what we are trying to build as Baha'is around the world. What comparison can you make between what you've seen in Wales with things that you've seen in Sierra Leone or other places that you've visited?
So it's very interesting because naturally our social realities are completely different, are very, very different. And my experiences in Greenland would in many ways be very different from my experiences in Newport, Wales, where I live. But the questions that we are asking ourselves are the same questions. That is the continuity. So we are asking ourselves, how do we go from a very passive environment into one in which we all participate and build? How do we learn how to become effective in these things? So for instance, in one of the areas of learning that we are involved in is in the area of the Junior Youth Program. And we are working with a local school. And in this case, the challenge that we're facing and addressing is that in Britain, and I've observed this is a challenge that is very global, in fact, that children seem to do okay in primary school, socially, emotionally, academically, and then they move to secondary school and something breaks. Often, obviously not always, but for many of them, somehow something in that transition creates behavioral problems, academic problems, mental health problems, and no one has quite worked out how to crack it. So we position the Junior Youth Program as a way of accompanying young people from beginning on their last year of primary school and accompanying them through high school. And what we've been learning there has been benefiting from the learning of a very different junior youth group model in another part of Wales in the same cluster. So now all of us who are addressing the work of junior youth are learning together and little by little building the capacity so that for the first time we're going to have our very first junior youth camp in the summer, where the junior youth groups from sort of the 2, possibly 3 areas that have it will come together and learn. And in this process, all the institutions are learning at the same process. But the key coherence is that we work in the same way as the rest of the planet, within the Baha'i framework, in cycles of 3 months. We act, we consult, we reflect, we modify. we have a tissue of support. If it was just me and the junior youth group and our fellow animators, it'd be great, but we'd struggle. But luckily, there's an auxiliary board member who is encouraging us all the time, helping us ask right questions, stimulating fora where everyone comes. And luckily, there are cluster reflection meetings where we bring our experience and we see how it fits in the context of wider community building efforts. And now our local spiritual assembly, a few members are hoping to train to start a children's class because there is a huge demand now for the children. And in the process, we're also encountering social issues that we're having to learn to deal. So social action becomes very organic with the process that we're building. I think that element, the element of how we learn and how we act, is a connecting tissue. That means that allows us to move from a cluster where there's just me and nothing is happening to a cluster where the entire population is engaged. What matters is not the speed of that transition, but the consistency of that transition. And that consistency happens through the gradual building of capacity to implement those processes of collective action and learning in every locality, which is what I think we're really learning. That's the meta learning, but that really is the learning that we're having. How do we learn to learn collectively?
Thank you. That's very interesting. And my impression from what you just said, and certainly from my own experience, is that the number of Baha'is who are getting involved has been steadily increasing. You mentioned people starting children's classes on your assembly, for example. Do you have a sense of sort of how that's been working in your area with the mobilization of the existing resources?
Yes, I think that there are a number of challenges, and probably the biggest is what I mentioned about the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed, which means that those who have been engaged in the forefront of these processes develop experiences and a language and a context which gives meaning to a lot of these terms and these ideas. If you have never yet experienced that capacity to have those conversations in your neighborhood, for example, if you haven't yet experienced that capacity to turn your love for the oneness of humanity, your love for the Baha'i teachings into a community building process, then it creates a gap. And so it's very hard then to move. Now, one of the interesting features of the Baha'i framework by which we are sort of transforming this is that the approach has not been for everyone to move at the same pace in the same way. Instead, the idea has been to create pockets of learning and build successes in the same way that we want to change the world by creating models that work rather than haranguing people into it. The change within the Baha'i community works the same way. So we are creating communities, clusters, that begin to crack certain of these questions, that learn how to build community from scratch, that learn how to develop thriving social action projects, that thriving junior youth programs, children's classes. And once that's actually happening, they become centers of learning and reservoir clusters. And what then happens is that people from those clusters with that experience travel to clusters that don't have that experience and accompany those communities that haven't yet experienced it. And vice versa, communities that haven't experienced it can travel to those communities that have those processes alive and are accompanied by people with a bit more experience and confidence into the field of action, so that when they return, they develop the encouragement and the confidence to take their own single step. And so this notion of accompaniment has become one of the most important words and concepts. There's an entire Ruhi book now, book 10, devoted to the art of accompaniment. How do we accompany each other? The idea that capacity is not pulled out or summoned up, but is built together. So, and that also there are no experts. that there is stuff that I might be strong in, but also weak in. So the same person I'm accompanying in one area might need to accompany me in another area. And I think as the community is building its skill and its insight into this process of accompaniment, then the engagement and the mobilization of more and more people is happening in a smoother and more fruitful way.
One of the things that I've noticed is that some people are continuing, of course, to become Baha'is through the older, if you want to put it that way, method of firesides and such. And some of them get engaged in the core activities, and some of them don't. And I'm wondering, on the one hand, what can be done to encourage people to become more involved in it. I think you've answered that part. But also, I think there also needs to be, we need to give people space. If they don't want to do certain things, they still have to feel like they're valued, active members of the community. And I'm wondering what your experience has been with that issue of balance.
I think another key term that has become as important as accompaniment is the concept of coherence. The idea that we have an instinctive nature to think in polar opposites, in dichotomies, and creating choices between things that are of equal importance to us. And that one of the qualities of maturity is the ability to integrate these things. So along those lines, I think one of the aspects is that as the questions that we ask become more universal, so how do we transform our local community? What are the needs of our community? That's a question that we all ask. The moment that we start asking that question of ourselves, of our neighbors, a unifying context emerges where everybody's contribution fits. And clearly the core activities of children's classes and junior youth groups and study circles and devotional meetings are an engine that allows us to multiply a whole range of other activities that grow out of it. They become artistic activities, social activities, environmental activities, and also our activities themselves become diverse. So one person's devotional meeting might be sitting around reading prayers. Another person's devotional meeting might be climbing a mountain as a group and stopping halfway. Another one would be to listen to very heavy metal music that connects you to the spirit. And for somebody, the idea of the heavy metal meeting would be death. And for somebody else, the idea of us sitting around reading prayers would be death. But if you have an environment where that diversity flourishes, then it becomes much more easy, I think, for people to find vehicles of self-expression that don't involve choosing between uniformity and sort of and isolation, where we're able to actually creatively express ourselves by integration, by trying to integrate whatever drives us within this framework in an imaginative leap, as opposed to having to divide ourselves between our work and our service, our studies and our service, the core activities and other activities, whatever it is. Actually, we're wanting to grow together.
I think that's a very good point, that getting us to the point where we have a room for diversity of expression is really the key to being able to include as many as people as possible. And certainly we see that in many communities. In smaller communities, I think people often will find a way to fit their interests into the plan. At least that's what I have seen generally.
One thing that I'd love to touch on from what you mentioned is that I think, again, in this shift of culture, our focus in the past was how do we go out into the community, into the wider community, in order to grow the Baha'i community? And our actual center of attention was how to grow the Baha'i community. And I think that was a historical artifact. We needed enough numbers before we could begin to have an impact on society. But I think the emphasis has changed. And you can see it, for instance, in that we used to collect statistics primarily on how many people were becoming Baha'is. And we haven't now for many years. We have a rough sense of 7 million or 6 million. But we haven't really, that's not what we're counting, because that's not actually what's counting for us. What we are counting is the number of people who are engaged in processes of community building, whether they are Baha'is or not. And I think that means that whereas before we were thinking, how do we go out into the community in order to grow the Baha'i community, today we're asking the opposite question. How do we use the Baha'i community to grow the wider community? And that is our question. And I think that shift is fundamental. It means that we measure our success not by conversions, but by transformations. And that we do still obviously anticipate and rejoice in sort of people converging with us in our identity as Baha'is, but we see the process of growth of Baha'i community growth as a byproduct of engagement in these processes. If we are building a transformational community through these tools, many people, perhaps the majority, will engage simply because the tools work and their children are happy and they are better able to deal with the challenges of life, and it's an uplifting and empowering thing, and it's transforming their communities. And that's why they're with us, and they feel equally in the driving seat, and they're problem solving with us. And there are clusters where all the processes are managed entirely by people who are not Baha'is. But it's obvious that also in that process, a proportion of those would see that the source of this enormous success and impact and power is the vision of Baha'u'llah, and they themselves might go, that is what I believe, I recognize it, and that's great. But I think our focus now is not necessarily in making that happen directly. Our focus is on growing the communities around us, and we anticipate that this will result in a broadening of our community. But I also think that is softening our identities. It also means that, where you draw the line at what is to be a Baha'i or not, it's much faster. And just declaring I'm a Baha'i is just one milestone. But actually, the life of a Baha'i goes beyond that and begins before that. And so to me, that is one of the key elements of that change of paradigm. And it's a different way of relating to each other.
Yes, I think that's an extremely important point. And I think either we misunderstood what the house meant, or perhaps the evolutionary process took us in a little bit of a direction that we weren't expecting, because the purpose of this 25-year period is to bring about entry by troops. And I think perhaps the entry by troops wasn't quite what we were thinking it was going to be. It's more like a community building process that brings people into the exercise of the revelation, shall we say, without necessarily bringing about membership. And I think that's something we didn't expect.
And I also think that that's a good example of recognizing how early we are in this process, and that our goal is to build a civilization, not a congregation. That we are not here to superimpose yet another religious community in the panoply of religious communities. Our labor is to connect humanity into a vision of oneness. And I think that redefines the concept of religion. It redefines the concept of membership, of identity. And when the Baha'i writings, the Baha'i community are the means of transformation, people engage with those means at all kinds of levels. And clearly membership is still meaningful, because we do not receive funds for the Baha'i community specifically unless you are a Baha'i. That's how we protect the integrity of the Baha'i community and also make sacred the leap of identity and distinguish that sense. And there are obviously, it's a very different orientation to relate to this as these are very good ideas to this is a guide to my life. But I do think that the nature of community is evolving in our minds, and it is natural that we would have partly inherited an outlook of community that was congregational and partly developed it by the necessity of building administrative structures that only Baha'is could be part of. But I think we are now, it's interesting, Shoghi Effendi said the second Baha'i century would see the first stirrings of the world order of Baha'i. And I think we're beginning to see those first stirrings. We're beginning to see these moments of where the vision of Baha'u'llah converges with the capacity to build society, to transform community. And we're seeing lives change. In the junior youth groups that we've been animating in Newport, several of the children had huge issues outside of the group, behavioral problems at school. We would not have guessed. We would not have known that any of those members of the group had behavioral problems. And the ones who had were at the very heart of the group. They were among the most helpful, most beautifully behaved, most nobly characterized young people. So this transformation is happening, and it doesn't depend on membership. And in that sense, it's a wonderful thing, because I think many of us joined the Baha'i community in the hopes that one day someone would be able to see some of this. And we now are adapting to the reality that actually it's been given to us the opportunity to begin to glimpse this in a way that future generations will take further.
One of the questions in my mind about all this process is, have we seen any, for example, mega churches or local congregations see what the Baha'is are doing and say, let's take this over and do it ourselves? I haven't heard of any examples of anybody trying to duplicate our efforts in that sense.
I haven't either in that sense, but I also don't think, I don't see how that endeavor really makes sense, insofar as I could see, not only can I see mega churches and non-religious bodies, there's lots of people doing junior youth group activities. There are lots of groups doing community building processes. There's fantastic work out there. I think precisely what makes our work distinctive is this framework of capacity building, is the fact that we have both a vision, a roadmap, a destination. So few of these movements have as detailed or as ambitious, or some would say unrealistic a vision. We're thinking a few centuries ahead, and our goal is to unify the whole of humanity. Most people aren't working to that agenda. They're working to tackle social exclusion or citizenship empowerment or whatever. But also most do not, what I can think of is I can't think of an equivalent global entity that has a system of community learning that is integrated in the way that the Baha'i community has developed in the last 20 years. And I think I have seen different groups, including churches, fitting in within that process. So one of the things, in fact, we've began to explore, for example, we shared with a local church-based community center how the Baha'i process is one where we gather together for 3 months, we read the reality of the community, we see where we are in relation to that reality, and we take some steps. And we said, would this be a way in which our wider community could work? And they were very enthusiastic about that, and very enthusiastic about incorporating that approach and experimenting with it. And I'm sure there's many, many more examples of that. But I don't think it really makes much sense, the idea of anyone duplicating it, because to duplicate it, they would have to embrace the vision of Baha'u'llah and the systems of learning that we have built. But what I do think is that there are a lot of communities, organizations, churches who see the tools that the Baha'is are offering as tools they can avail themselves of and be part of. And we have seen, different groups, police, community groups, etc., say, yes, we want to be part of your discussion of this process that you're doing, because we see that tools are relevant and we see that we don't need to be Baha'is in order to join or harness this process for our own agendas of building good communities.
Got two questions now. Ethel says, I don't have so much a question, but a comment. That is, I think it is really great you referred to the Promise of World Peace that was published in 1985. I have a copy of the children's edition that came out and mentioned this in our community but didn't get much response. How can I get more response about the children's edition of the Promise of World Peace?
I mean, obviously, I don't know about your community and the response, but I do sort of empathize very much with the love of that document. I think it remains an incredible document. Its discussion of human nature, of the barriers to change, etc., is truly beautiful. And I heard anecdotally, I don't know if it's true, it might not be true, but I heard that a member of the House of Justice allegedly or reportedly said that they hesitated more over the one line, we offer the Baha'i community as a model for study, than over any other line. Whether it is true or not, it rings true, doesn't it? It is the fact that it's the first time that the Baha'i community, that the House of Justice felt the Baha'i community was ready to be offered as a tool and as an example. So I think it is definitely something worth revisiting. But I also think in terms of gaining more enthusiasm, it's the same principle, isn't it? That we don't need to push people into our sense of what works or what's right, that our goal is to embody it. So I would say that if you think that the children's edition of the Promise of World Peace has great potential, then a really good thing would be to apply it and maybe sort of create a children's activity around that document. And if that document has a beautiful impact on those children, then it's very likely that others in the community will then have the discussion, and the discussion then becomes very different. It doesn't become should we listen to Ethel's idea or not? It becomes, what can we learn from Ethel's wonderful experience? And how can we replicate it from it? So I think whenever we want to achieve change, including within our own local Baha'i community, the best route is to try and create an embodiment or an example of the change we want to see. And if we can demonstrate its impact and its value, then it will be much easier for others to see it too, and then to accompany us or to be accompanied into that process, because we can't always get each other's insights from a distance, as it were, from the distance of another brain, but we can often from the proximity of an example.
Very good. Keith says, are we seeing evidence that international development organizations are looking closely at these examples of social action and considering new approaches to, quote, development? He also says, how can one accelerate one's own learning to catch up with all that is happening? It is all very exciting. Beside the video, A Widening Embrace, are there other repositories that summarize all that has happened?
So there are a number of, so the first question was about social and economic development. And I can't say I am an expert on the state of discourse on all of these things, but I can say that the establishment of the new institution in the Baha'i World Center is a demonstration that we have reached a really remarkable level of capacity in this area, and that the learning is happening in the same way, that we are systematically learning about socioeconomic development in different areas and different modes. So I was, as far as I remember, just working from memory, about 4 or 5 years ago, there were around 27 Baha'i-inspired development agencies developing community-based schools and there were around 130 community schools or something like that in again in over 100 clusters around the world. And in some of the learning was being systematized. So what do we learn when we build community schools? Here, 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 and here. In some places, the frontiers of learning were very advanced, and in those places, the results of that were that fourth graders were exceeding the success of sixth graders in the national system. And those schools were happening, I think this was in Central African Republic. And those schools were happening in areas where the government could not reach at that point and couldn't provide those schools. So this is what gave birth to the Baha'i schools. So you can see that in areas like this, certainly agents of change are learning. In the video, in Widening Embrace, the one I was going to show the clip was in Kiribati, where a very large proportion of the junior youth population of the island has gone through the junior youth empowerment process. And as a result, teenage alcoholism, teenage violence, teenage incarceration have all dropped across society. And you can imagine that, again, those things are commanding the insight of it. And what I read before from the House of Justice, that in the most advanced clusters where a few hundred Baha'is are mobilizing a few thousands into, and all of these elements of the process, not just one, but where you have all these coherent processes going on, perhaps over 2 generations now, that in those places, the entirety of society is beginning to rethink how it works at a local level, inspired by the Baha'i teachings, and that the current learning, the frontier of learning of the Baha'i community globally today is, let's learn about how we change societies. Now that's incredible to me, that we have reached a stage where we're now asking ourselves that question in a practical way, not in a theoretical or abstract way. How do we change this society and this society and this society? Because we are actually doing so. So we are now beginning to gather enough experience of that we're able to begin to reflect on it and begin to build models that the rest of the Baha'i world will eventually be able to apply. From their experience, it will no longer be just Lumumbashi or Kiribati or whatever. It will be the way Baha'is do this is. And we know this because we've tried it in these 27 places, and societies have changed really well. And this is how you can do it in a much more straightforward way, because they've made all the mistakes for us. So yes is the answer to your question, just obviously concentrated in places. And to the second question about where do you go to catch up, as it were, with all of this stuff that's happening, there are a few resources. The video that you mentioned is certainly a really great introductory protocol. In terms of the writings, if you want to really grasp what the new language is all about, what the new processes are all about, there is a book called Framework for Action, which collects the messages of the Universal House of Justice and some of the institutions that all sort of track the evolution of this. And today, everyone who's kind of working in the frontiers of learning at this is going back to that book over and over and over to reflect on experience, on local experience in light of that global experience and that global guidance. So getting that book, and it's available online in the sort of reference library, is a really good guide to the material. But above all things, I would say that the very best way to learn is to find a cluster near you that is advancing any of these areas and spend time. And part of their duty, as it were, and call and mission is to accompany others. So if you reach out and you say, I'd like to learn, then you can do so and accompany them. But all of this will only really take off in terms of understanding once you find, and I'm not presuming you are not already, but basically that you take your next step, whatever that step is, in relation to your understanding of that guidance and that process. So you might already be, very active in a number of these processes. And there is a next frontier of learning. This is a term that's being used. Another term is the concept of a frontier of learning, that there's stuff that we know, and there's stuff that it's at the edge of our vision. But within our vision, it's not imagination, it's not theory, is what is the next thing that I can learn about, that I need to learn about. So if you can identify your next frontier of learning and then move in that direction, and ideally find someone with some experience of it that could accompany you in some way, learn with you, then that combination of individual action, of accompaniment and example, and of study and reflection and the guidance is, I think, probably the best route to feel connected to all this. And of course, confirmation then flows, and the learning explodes.
Well, I think that's all of our questions. And this has been a fascinating session, Ismael. I want to thank you very much for giving us your time and your insights about the current framework of action. I hope it will inspire a lot of interest amongst our audience to dig deeper and to become more involved in ways they feel they can fit in. Since it's a very flexible framework, there are many entry points, you might say, where people can become involved. And I hope we can encourage people to do that. So thank you again very much. I want to end this session now. I want to thank everyone very much for joining us.